In this video, I take you through some of my personal highlights from the ADAC Sim Racing Expo 2024 in Dortmund, Germany, exploiting my press badge to its fullest extent to grab some freebies and try out some shiny new stuff, and all from an older gamer's perspective. Speaking of shiny new stuff, probably one of the biggest draws of this show was, of course, Assetto Corsa Evo, particularly as a few weeks earlier Kunos announced that Evo would be available for everyone to try and not just the favoured YouTube few. The version actually available to the general public at various places around the expo was labelled a pre-alpha build. Make of that what you will. But to me, that kind of says AC Evo is a fair way away from reaching a release date. Although Kunos do still say that an early access version will be available on the 16th of January 2025. We shall see. Personally, after trying out Evo on 3 different wheelbases at 3 different stands in the expo, I am fairly confident the early access version will happen. I am just not so sure when the final release will occur. In fact, going by my test drives at the show, I think it's likely that Evo isn't going to see a full commercial release until well into the second quarter of 2025. As I said, Evo was all over the expo, and if you came to Dortmund just to try that out, the chances were you would not be disappointed, so long as you didn't mind queuing for a bit. I stumbled across my first Evo session at the Logitech stand using the G Pro direct drive wheelbase. Choices of what and where to drive were limited to 3 cars on 3 different tracks. Here in this first try of Evo, I was driving the Hyundai i30N at Brands Hatch in sunny conditions but on a damp track. The first thing that struck me was how quick the load time happened. From selecting the scenario to being placed in the car was very quick indeed, probably the quickest I have seen of any sim. In fact, I was soon leaving the pit lane and entering the Brands Hatch GP circuit that we all know and love. Graphically, Evo is stunning to look at, with sun rays shining in through the window and some nice non-glitchy shadows flowing past. The detail around the track was also phenomenal, with crowds and cranes and trackside fences and all that other sim racing furniture being rendered to a high level of detail. There was even some basic animation from trackside officials, although not a huge amount in this early version. The cars also look great, with the interiors pretty much what we've come to expect from today's modern sim racers. On track, the steering seemed responsive enough, the on-screen wheel mostly matching my movements, and I experienced no lag from the pedal inputs either. In all, a very positive experience and a mostly enjoyable drive.
I feel a butt coming on.
But I found the force feedback with the G Pro wheelbase to be lacking in a certain way. It was difficult to put my finger on it, and later on I found a video from Gamer Muscle who said he had a similar experience with a Fanatec wheel and removed some dampening filters which gave him a better drive. I will link that video below. It's very good, you should watch it. But I did this as well with the G Pro with the help of a technician on the Logitech stall who attempted to improve the force feedback for Evo for me. But even after several attempts at changing various settings on the wheel, I still had a force feedback experience that was muted. It was there. I could feel the force feedback. If I went over the rumble strips, they were bumping the wheel along very nicely. But when I was powering down a straight, there was very little feeling for the road texture. It was there in the background of the FFB, but I couldn't feel it as clearly as I would have liked. Certainly not as clearly as I can feel it on my Mazda R9 on my rig at home using AC1. No matter what I tried, the FFB of Evo felt lackluster. Better in hard turns and over the rumble strips, as I just said, but not very enthusiastically announcing itself when I went over grass or into gravel or simply drove at speed down the tarmac straights. So, after this session, I went away, had a coffee and what passes for lunch in Germany, and returned to Evo again, but this time on the Case King stand where they had Moza wheelbases to race Evo with. Moza R9 is my daily drive, and I've been using AC1 a lot these last few weeks, so I figured that I would be able to get a better like-for-like impression of how the FFB in Evo was actually performing. But, again, just like the Logitech, there was a feeling of Evo's FFB being muted, like music played on someone else's earbuds while riding the bus. I could hear the beat, but not really well enough to identify the tune. I even tried changing cars for this test, favouring the Porsche at Imola, to see if it was the Hyundai giving this muted feedback, or indeed if it was Brands Hatch that was the problem. However, the same issues with Evo's FFB persisted for me in the Porsche Cop car at Imola. The force feedback was clearly there and it was usable. It just wasn't loud enough for my own personal tastes, if that makes sense. I know this is a personal thing, but I'm trying to get over to you what I personally took away from this demo. So, after all of that, I figured it was time to do a back-to-back comparison of Evo and AC1 by going to the Hyundai stand, where they had rigs set up to a high standard using the Fanatec wheelbase, with 6 rigs on the right here using AC1 and the 6 on the left using AC Evo. After yet another session of QR code scanning, something I did a lot at this expo, and queuing with sim racing fans who were so enthusiastic they even remembered to bring their gloves with them, I was able to get a good session on AC1. And then literally a few moments after I finished that session, I was sitting in an identical rig racing with AC Evo. And yes, there is a but coming. But again, I found the force feedback of Evo was simply lacking. The feeling of the FFB was just muted. That's the best way I can describe it. It was just not fully there. Even more pronounced in my head using Evo, because I had only a few moments earlier been driving AC1 with exactly the same setup. I have no idea why my conclusions about the force feedback in Evo runs so at odds with all the various other first impression videos that have been published on YouTube and you have no doubtly watched. Possibly it was because the YouTubers in question were using a rig on the Fanatec stand inside a glass case that only a few people got access to. And although that version also said pre-alpha, it could be that it was a later version, a later pre-alpha version of the one that I was using, and had perhaps better force feedback. Maybe, I don't know. All I can tell you is that on the 3 setups I used, the Evo force feedback system felt incomplete and lacking volume. Like I said earlier, the fact that we are seeing a pre-alpha version and not a pre-beta or even a beta candidate would seem to indicate that the release date for Evo is a long way off, and Kunos still have plenty of time to work on these FFB issues. That to one side, Evo did show me it had great potential to change the face of sim racing, just so long as the release is well managed and relatively bug-free. Will that happen? I don't know, but this pre-alpha was running really well, and aside from the FFB issues, it's a good indication that Kunos will soon release another groundbreaking sim for us all to enjoy.
Getting excited!
In a way, it's a shame that Evo stole so much of the Expo's thunder, as there were a number of other great products being showcased for the first time at this show. One of the most exciting, in my opinion, for people looking for their first direct drive wheel was the T-598, a brand new type of direct drive wheel from Thrustmaster. What's exciting about the Thrustmaster T-598 is it differs from the standard design approach of direct drive wheels by using an axial flux motor instead of the radial flux motor found in most DD wheelbases. Yes, flux motors are really a thing in direct drive wheels.
Flux capacitor,
fluxing.
In this image, you can see the radial flux design that's used in most direct drive wheels today. The magnets, which are used to rotate the wheel and give us the FFB that we know and love, are mounted on the inside, which is expensive to build, can generate a lot of heat in usage, and also suffers from notching, where the rotation of the wheel is not as smooth as it ideally could be. On the T-598, the axial flux design is used, with the magnets being mounted parallel to the shaft here, which theoretically leads to a smoother rotation, so less notching, and also less potential heat buildup, which in itself could potentially give us more powerful units for less money. It all sounds good in theory, doesn't it? And certainly seems to be good in the price area, with the T-598 as a bundle with pedals and a basic wheel coming in at an enticing $499, which is for a model giving you around 5 Newton meters. But how did the T-598 behave in real life when I got a chance to actually use it? Here I am driving ACC one-handed, mostly because I didn't have anyone to give the camera to or anywhere to mount it. And as you can see, even though this motor is only rated at 5 Newton meters, the strength of the axial flux design provides a constant torque, and this should not be underestimated. And it was very capable and gave the FFB feeling of a much stronger unit. In fact, at times, driving one-handed like this was a real challenge and a great workout for my arms. I also tried the T-598 on the PS5 using GT7 in rally driving mode, and man, did that give a healthy amount of FFB as the car bounced around in that typical rally style. Sadly, I didn't get footage of this, but trust me, it works just as well on the PS5 as it does on the PC. The T-598 to me has the performance level and price to be a game changer in the direct drive market, and the axial flux design may well become the dominant design feature of all mid-price level direct drive wheels in the future. I've reached out to Thrustmaster for a review copy, and I hope to get one soon so that I can evaluate it here and also compare it with the Moza R9. Subscribe now for future videos.
I'm going to go do that right now.
For me personally, one of the biggest and most profound disappointments at the Sim Racing Expo 2024 was a lack of support for virtual reality headsets. Indeed, the only one there flying the VR flag appeared to be Pimax, and even they did not have their own stand, instead choosing to share with other various companies. This did make tracking down and trying a Pimax a little tricky, and because there were only around 4 different units available, the queues for trying one out were long and very much oversubscribed. I managed to chance on my session simply by being in the right place at the right time, and was able to briefly test the Pimax Crystal Light. This was a very short test session, and it wasn't in the best circumstances, with a lot of eager testers breathing down my neck, waiting for me to finish, and a rig that wasn't the best fit for my elderly frame. But no matter, I got to race with it and got an initial feel for the Crystal Light's capabilities, which is that it felt like a decent enough headset with a pretty good field of view. It's heavier than my usual VR headset, the Quest 3, and I didn't find either the strap or the facial interface to be particularly comfortable. But as I said, this was a rapid in and out test. More of a taster session really, rather than a good chance to evaluate the Crystal Light against the Quest 3. I have put in a request to Pimax for a review unit, which I'm hoping to try and compare against the Quest 3 at some point in the future, just to see really if the direct port input of the Crystal Light really does make a difference over the compressed USB connection of the Quest 3, and if the FOV, the field of view, which is purportedly greater in the Crystal Light, really does make much of a difference when you're sim racing. I'll keep you updated on when or if I get a review unit to test.
Fingers crossed.
So if you were not there for VR and looking instead for various monitor solutions for your sim rig, you would have been delighted, as I think pretty much every variation of the monitor setup was on show here, from flat screens to curved wides to ultra wides to triples and ultra-wide triples, you would have been spoilt for choice. I tried a few, and yes, they were all very raceable. I found that I did better on the ultra-wides rather than the triples for whatever reason, and found that with the triples I was tending to ignore most of the real estate backwards from my peripheral vision. But that may have just been my lack of experience with this type of setup, as I tend to favour VR. Some of the monitor options were very extreme, including this beamer solution that gave me motion sickness just watching from the sidelines, to full wraparounds like this one, which were a little tricky for the older gamer to get in and out of. And if none of that suits you, what about an actual race car that replaces the front windscreen with a monitor? Now that's what you call immersion.
I am impressed.
Speaking of immersion, there was of course plenty of motion rigs on display, and this year I actually got to try a number of them, and despite my misgivings for the technology, I really got into motion. So much so that when I tried a rig without motion, I really felt like something was totally missing, which is a surprise to me, as motion rigs are not something that I've been keen on in the past. They still have lots of issues, mostly the price and the amount of room you need to have one, but also fixing monitors securely to a motion platform is problematic, especially if you wanted to try that with triples. That being said, motion rigs are a lot of fun, and if I had the money and the room to use one, I would order one yesterday. And if you really want to go wild, there was the D-Box experience that not only placed me in the motion rig, but my audience sitting behind me as well, who could also experience the thrill of my bad driving on a motion platform in the sim racing title, which in this case was Le Mans Ultimate. Truly, we live in the future.
For the future is being made today.
This year's show was, in my opinion, a vast improvement on last year's, and I really enjoyed last year's show. So it seems like the Sim Racing Expo just keeps getting better. It still needs an extra day, in my opinion, for press and business to talk for longer with the busy people on the stands. Perhaps a Thursday. Maybe we will see that in the future. In the meantime, this whistle-stop tour of mine through just a few of my personal favourites from the 2024 Sim Racing Expo has only really just scratched the surface of what was really there. And honestly, there was so much more to see. And if you are a sim racing fan who can get to Dortmund, you really do owe it to yourself to make that journey. Even if it's just to see the real cars or an actual helicopter that the German army brought to the show just because, well, they could. But amongst the motion rigs, the racing areas, the new technology, there were some new features such as the women's arena to silence the claim that women don't sim race. And around the expo, there were sim racing fans, young and old, all clearly enjoying this wonderful event. So if you've never been to a Sim Racing Expo, I encourage you to attend next year's, either in Austin in Texas in March or Dortmund, Germany next October. In the meantime, I hope you found this video helpful, and until the next one, race clean, and I'll see you on track. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click the little bell icon if you want to be notified of any future videos.